Welcome to the lecture entitled Teleology in Scientific Explanation. I'm Andrew Chapman. In this lecture, we'll discuss 8 topics. 1. Aristotle's 4 causes. 2. Causation, Mechanism, and Explanation. 3. Aristotle's 4 causes and how and why questions. 4. Unsatisfying causal explanations. 5. Teleological explanation. 6. Purposes, intentions, Explanandum-Teleology and Explanans-Teleology. 7. Causal explanation of the teleological in terms of belief-desire pairs. And 8. Teleological explanations and causal explanations, cautions and conclusions. Even though most people see scientific explanations as in some way unique and generally better within the domain of natural phenomena than non-scientific explanations, it's important to remember that scientific explanations are still explanations. Thus, if there's something that all explanations have in common, then scientific explanations will have this feature as well. One thing that we can learn from this is that by looking at what we're generally doing in giving and asking for explanations, we can get a general picture of what it is that explanations need to have, and what all explanations need to have will be shared by specifically scientific explanations. We ask for explanations via questions. Nearly always these questions are either why questions or how questions. When asking why questions or how questions, then, what are you asking for? What sort of thing are you looking for as a response? And when somebody asks you a why question or a how question, how is it appropriate for you to respond? In what sorts of ways have you responded to such questions recently in your life? Questions of explanations, what sorts of things count as good explanations for phenomena, go back at least as far as Aristotle. Aristotle was an ancient Greek philosopher and scientist. He was the most famous student of Plato and the tutor of the boy who would grow up to be Alexander the Great. His philosophy covered nearly every philosophical subdiscipline, and his taxonomy of the philosophical subdisciplines is still with us to this day, and much of his work, especially in ethics, exerts a substantial influence on contemporary philosophy. According to Aristotle, a thing can be explained in 4 ways, and these ways aren't conflicting with one another. Oftentimes, a combination of these ways will get a more complete understanding of the thing in question. Aristotle called these 4 ways atia, a term which is generally translated confusingly as causes into English, but which might better be translated as reasons or grounds for the thing's existing in just the way it does. I'll continue to use the word causes for Aristotle's 4 grounds or reasons or ways, because causes is the standard way of talking about Aristotle's 4 grounds or reasons. These 4 causes are known as the material cause, the formal cause, the efficient cause. The efficient cause is the only one that resembles what we would today call a cause or causation, and the final cause. Even though Aristotle explicated his conception of explanation in terms of the four causes 2.5 millennia ago, each of the types of cause finds its way into our everyday practice of giving and asking for explanations. Something's material cause is the physical stuff, the material, out of which it is composed. Something's formal cause is the complete shape, the overall form that its physical stuff takes. Something's efficient cause is what occurred such that the physical stuff out of which the thing is composed has the form that it does, what brought its matter and its form together. And something's final cause is its purpose, what it's for. Take a ship as an example. A ship's material cause is boards, nails, etc. Its formal cause is the form of a ship, curved hull, flat deck, etc. Its efficient cause is the work of workers who fashioned the boards and the nails, etc., and turned them into a ship. Its final cause is sailing, the thing it's for. Notice that understanding each of the causes of a ship tells you a little bit more about why it exists in precisely the way it does, and thus, learning each of a thing's four causes explains that thing in a specific way. Mechanism about the world is the thesis that the natural world functions like a giant and complex machine. Today, the standard picture of the world is something like mechanism. This is a rejection of much of Aristotle's physics in favor of a picture of the world where the only explanation that's needed is akin to Aristotle's efficient cause, or what we would today just call causation. A famous mechanist known as Pierre Laplace said this: "We may regard the present state of the universe as the effect of the past and the cause of the future. An intellect which at any given moment knew all of the forces that animate nature and the mutual positions of the beings that compose it, if this intellect were vast enough to submit the data to analysis, could condense into a single formula the movement of the greatest bodies of the universe and that of the lightest atom. For such an intellect, nothing could be uncertain, and the future, just like the past, would be present before its eyes." Notice what Laplace is saying here about what makes things the things they are, what puts them where they are, when they are, what gives them the properties that they have. It's all, in Aristotle's terminology, efficient causation. You don't need to know the material cause, the formal cause, or the final cause. You just need to know efficient causation and how things are arranged at a particular time. So if the world functions like a machine, then an understanding of the causal connections between events would leave nothing out. It would be a complete understanding of those events. When Newton's physics showed up on the scene and replaced Aristotle's physics, one of the big revolutions that Newton introduced into scientific physics was an understanding of the physical world as purely governed by causation. We didn't need to know anymore the type of stuff, the form of the stuff, or the end result of the stuff, the goal of the stuff, in order to have a complete explanation of the natural world. Nonetheless, it's still illuminating to understand the notion of explanation in terms of Aristotle's four causes, since it did seem intuitively like each of Aristotle's four causes was getting at something important about the notion of explanation. In terms of the standard simple list of interrogative pronouns who, what, when, where, why, and how, only two, why and how, are clearly relevant to requests for explanation, while the other four are mostly relevant to requests for descriptions of things. Here is how those two interrogative pronouns, why and how, interact with Aristotle's four causes. The material cause seems to be telling us about how does this particular thing have the properties that it does. Material causes are related to how questions generally, and not why questions. Formal causes seem to be asking, how does this function the way it does? We might respond to a question like that in terms of the form of the thing. So formal causes also seem to be related to questions about how something is the way it is. Efficient cause, or what we would today just call causation, what the mechanist thinks is the only thing that matters. Efficient causes seem to be asking about, how did this thing get this way? What brought this about? So again, this seems to be related to how questions. It's the final cause that seems to be asking a why question. Why, that is, for what reason, for what purpose does this thing have the properties that it does? Why does it function the way that it does? Why did it get this particular way and not some other way? Those why questions seem to be different from the how questions that could be answered by pointing to a material cause, a formal cause, or an efficient cause. So we're seeing some tension here between an Aristotelian picture of explanation and a picture of explanation that's governed entirely by causation. While causation might be able to make sense of material, formal, and efficient causal questions, that final cause seems different in the sort of thing that it's asking about. It's not asking how, but why. A central component of successful explanation is the bringing about of understanding on the point of the person asking for explanation. And what's supposed to be understood is the phenomenon under question, the natural world, the way things actually are. Oftentimes, this understanding can be accomplished by the asker knowing facts about something's causal relations to other things. So it's not as though people who are asking for causal explanations are wrong. A lot of the time, citing causes does seem to be exactly what's being asked for when somebody asks for an explanation. However, regardless of how important knowledge of causal relations is for understanding, there is at least sometimes a further component to understanding, the component that we might call reasonableness. To understand how some phenomenon is reasonable is to understand the reason behind that phenomenon. And there's a long tradition in philosophy that recognizes a categorical distinction between causation on the one hand and reasons on the other hand, such that knowledge of causation is not relevant to knowledge of reasons. Imagine that you see me putting on t-shirt after t-shirt until I'm wearing 15 t-shirts and I can barely move. If you ask me why I'm wearing 15 t-shirts, a description on my part of the merely causal processes that led to my wearing so many t-shirts won't be satisfying to you. You might say, all right, that's part of the story, but I was asking, why are you doing that? What's the reason behind that? And if I give you mere causes, you don't understand why what I'm doing is reasonable. Or imagine that you're a student of biology, maybe in high school, learning for the first time about the organs present in the human body. You notice that one of these things is a heart, and you ask for an explanation of the heart. A description of the causal processes that make the heart do what it does, pump mostly, won't be satisfying to you. You weren't asking just what does it do, but why does it do what it does. What's missing in both of these merely causal explanations is the reason for the thing under investigation, for its function, its purpose, its goal. By asking a why question, what you're looking for seems to be some answer in terms of function or purpose or goal, and that just doesn't seem to be the sort of thing that you can be made to understand by the citing of merely causal processes. Teleological explanations are explanations that rely on descriptions of functions or purposes or goals. Telos is Greek for goal or end or purpose. You and I give teleological explanations to one another all the time in non-scientific contexts. In fact, teleological explanations might be the majority sort of explanation in non-scientific contexts. Why did you go to the store? To get bread. Notice that getting bread was the purpose of going to the store. Why did the cat hide? So as not to get attacked by the dog. Notice that not getting attacked by the dog was the goal of hiding. Why do the lungs exist? For respiration. Notice that respiration is the purpose, the function of lungs. Teleological explanations give the reason for the phenomenon under investigation. However, since teleology is forward-looking in time, and causation is backward-looking in time, it seems as though teleological explanations and causal explanations are two fundamentally different sorts of things. When I get in the car to go to the store to get bread, what explains what I'm doing isn't something that happened before I got into the car, but something that I'm hoping will happen after I get into the car. I'll get bread. When the cat hides, it's not only because the cat got startled, but because the cat doesn't want to, in a rudimentary sort of way, get attacked by the dog. The function of the lungs is explained by what the lungs will do, not just the causal processes that brought the lungs about. So on the one hand, we have causal explanation, explanations to how sorts of questions. On the other hand, we have teleological explanation, explanations to why sorts of questions, and it seems like there is a fundamental difference between the two of them. We know that scientists are comfortable giving causal explanations of phenomena. In fact, the paradigm examples of scientific explanations seem to come in the form of causal stories. So what should we do about the apparent explanatory power of teleological explanations? It's not as though somebody is forcing teleological explanations on us and making us deal with them. Teleological explanations seem commonplace. These seem normal in our explanatory practices. If scientists are saying, well, we're comfortable mainly with causal explanations, how can we reconcile our everyday explanatory practices in terms of giving teleological explanations with scientific explanatory practices that come in terms of causal explanations? Well, we have four broad options. One option is to show that teleological explanations aren't real explanations. Maybe what we're doing when we give teleological explanations just appears to be giving an explanation when it isn't really. This is going to be difficult given that it really does seem like oftentimes when we give teleological explanations, we're giving totally acceptable explanations. 2. Maybe we could show that teleological explanations are actually causal explanations in disguise. This would explain why teleological explanations seem to be good explanations. The problem is that we have just miscategorized them as teleological when in fact they aren't. They're causal and there are no teleological explanations. So notice that the difference between 1 and 2 is that with 1, teleological explanations are being thrown out as not actually explanations. In 2, teleological explanations are being retained. What's being thrown out is the teleological part, but not because there was a teleological component to explanation and we're getting rid of it, but because we were wrong. Apparently, teleological explanations aren't actually teleological at all. They are merely causal explanations. Or 3, show that even though there's no room for teleological explanations in physics, and it seems like physics does not talk about teleology, it just talks about causal relations between things. Genuine teleological processes emerge at levels that are higher than physics, like chemistry or biology or psychology. If we choose 3, then we're going to have to make sense of this notion of emergence, where new teleological processes can emerge at higher levels. Or 4, we could show that there are genuine teleological processes at the level of physics, and that physicists have simply been ignoring these processes. Now notice that none of 1 through 4 is saying that science is bad or wrong. It's important when we're discussing teleological explanation to recognize that people who are trying to reconcile teleological explanation with current scientific practice aren't saying that scientists are bad or have been getting it all wrong. So this isn't anti-science, it's trying to make sense of, to reconcile how teleology and causal scientific explanations can coexist, or how one can be reduced to the other, or something like that. Whenever someone mentions purpose in science, or broadly in philosophy more generally, people start assuming that discussion of God can't be far behind. Thus, theists, people who believe that God exists, generally love the prospect of teleological explanations because they think that such explanations are related to the creative and purposive action of God. And for the very same reason, non-theists, and those who just think that God and science have nothing to do with one another, generally hate the prospect of teleological explanations. This is why we need to be very careful when we're trying to make sense of how teleological explanations and scientific, causal, standard sorts of explanations are related, to note that we're not saying that science is bad or wrong or trying to deny science. It's very important to keep two concepts separate from one another when discussing teleological explanations. These are the concepts of purpose and intention. Now, while it's plausible that all intentions are purposive, it's not clear why things could only have purposes in relation to the intentions of some other thing. Thus, if I intend to do something, that probably means that I have a specific purpose. But it doesn't seem to work the other way. It seems like there might be things that have purposes, that are purposive, that aren't related to the intentions of something. If somebody wants to claim that all purposive things require a relation to the intentions of some other thing, they need to give an argument to show why intentions are required for purpose. And in fact, Aristotle's physics was teleological without requiring that purposiveness be related to the intentions of some creator. While it's true that Aristotle did have a picture of a creator, according to Aristotle, the world is purposive all on its own. It didn't require the intentions of a god or a creator. Thus, both theists and non-theists, and of course people who just think that God and science should have nothing to do with each other, should not make the mistake of thinking that when we start talking about teleological explanation, that that is getting us any closer to God's existence or saying that God is a part of science or anything like that. These are two separate issues. And even further, there are two different sorts of teleological explanation. There are teleological explanations that appeal to the purpose of the explanandum, the thing that's being explained, and there are teleological explanations that appeal to the purposes of the explanans, of the thing doing the explaining. So for example, if you ask me why the car is on, and I tell you that I'm letting it warm up to melt the ice on the windshield, then I've given you a teleological explanation. I've told you what my purpose was in doing that. But it's my purpose that's the explanation for the explanandum of the car being on. I'm not appealing to the car's purposes, I'm appealing to my purposes here. This is an explanation where it is the purpose of the explanans that's relevant to the explanandum, and the explanandum doesn't have a purpose at all. On the other hand, if you ask me why the heart moves in the particular physical way that it does, and I say, in order to pump blood, then I've given you a teleological explanation where the purpose of the explanandum, the heart, acts as the explanans for the explanandum. So back to God again, while God's purposes might provide an explanation of the first sort here, they don't provide an explanation of the second sort, and generally, if teleological explanations are going to be given in science, then they're of the second sort. So God really is not relevant to scientific teleological explanations. Now, of course, this doesn't say anything at all about God's existence or whether God created any of this stuff, not at all. This is just saying that teleological explanations are not on their own connected to God. So I am really trying to show you that you can be okay with teleological explanations without having to say anything about God one way or the other. Also, you can be okay with God without having to say anything about teleological explanations. One of the main things that teleological explanations traditionally have been given for is the behavior of humans, as well as other similar thinking things. A teleological explanation of Andrew's behavior is given in terms of Andrew's goals. And a popular attempt to show that human behavior can be explained without appealing to teleology provides causal explanations of behavior in terms of pairs of beliefs and desires, both of which are mere brain states, and a brain is a physical thing that stands in causal relations to things. Thus, we can explain Andrew's behavior without reference to Andrew's goals. Just appeal to specific beliefs and desires, that's all that's needed. So, somebody might say, yes, you could give a teleological explanation for why the car is on in terms of Andrew's goal of melting the ice. Or you could just say that Andrew believes that turning the car on will melt the ice, and he desires to have the ice melted. Neither of those things is a teleological thing. And once we get the belief and the desire together, that's enough to provide a causal explanation of what we used to think was only explainable in terms of teleology. So this is an attempt to try to show that things that we thought were teleological explanations are actually just causal explanations in disguise. We might have used teleological language, but when we get really clear on the language that we're using, and part of science is to get really clear on the language and concepts that we're employing in explanation, we can see that there really is no teleology. Now, of course, if we really want to eliminate teleological explanations in situations such as these, we'll also need to claim that beliefs and desires are fully caused by other things. It can't be that I have the desire or the belief because of some goal that I have, because that would just be reintroducing teleological explanation. But this brings about issues of human freedom and moral responsibility, issues that we don't have the space to talk about here. If our behaviors are entirely determined by brain states that are themselves entirely determined, we might wonder, is there room for human freedom? Is there room for moral responsibility? Of course, just because our best science says that there's no room for freedom or responsibility, if that's what our best science says, that's no reason to throw out our best science. But notice that talking about teleological explanation, its relation to causal explanation, all of a sudden brings up issues that are relevant to philosophy and to our existential situation as living humans. The project of attempting to show how teleological explanations are unnecessary or are in fact merely disguised causal explanations is a project of explanatory reduction. That's redescribing apparently teleological things in merely causal terms. But a caution here. We need to be careful when we start explanatorily reducing teleological explanations to causal ones, if that's actually possible. First, unless it's shown that there is something bad about teleological explanations, we needn't be overzealous about the reductionist project. Maybe it is the case that we can reduce the teleological to the causal, but maybe we don't need to do that if there's nothing particularly unscientific or bad about the teleological. Generally, people who try to reduce the teleological to the causal think either that it brings God into the picture or that it's spooky or somehow unscientific, but unless it can be shown that the teleological results in these negative consequences, maybe we shouldn't try so hard to get rid of the teleological, even if we could. Second, even if it's possible to reduce all teleological explanations to causal ones, that doesn't mean that we should do it. And third, unless we can show that causation is the most basic explanatory force governing the natural world, we shouldn't treat teleological reduction to the causal, if that's possible, as a goal or a triumph. Most of the time when people try to reduce the teleological to the causal, that's because they think the causal is more real or more basic or more special in some way than the teleological. But that also needs to be shown via argument. So again, just because we can reduce the teleological to the causal, if we can, that doesn't mean we ought to without some further argumentation. What's the conclusion of all of this? Well, the current state of the debate between those who insist on the necessity of teleological explanations and those who insist on eliminating such explanations or reducing them to causal explanations is very complicated. There are a number of authors out there, even a number of authors who write introductory scientific philosophical books, who claim that one way or the other, teleological or reductionist picture has won the day. But these people are oversimplifying the situation. We need to admit that it has not actually been possible for proponents of the eliminativist, reductionist project to eliminate or reduce all teleological explanations. So, what they've generally claimed is that the remaining teleological explanations are either not actually explanations, or that these explanations will eventually be able to be reduced to the causal. However, this isn't a win for the proponents of teleological explanations, the fact that their explanations have not yet been eliminated or reduced, unless proponents of teleological explanations can show how such explanations fit into a world that is, in many ways, causally structured. If somebody wants to introduce teleology into science, they can't just introduce it and then walk away. They need to show how there is a compelling, coherent scientific picture where the causal and the teleological work side by side or even hand in hand. One thing, however, that everybody in this discussion should agree on is that teleological explanations are neither anti-science nor pro-theology. Proponents of teleological explanations are just as pro-science as are their opponents, and God simply has nothing to do with scientific teleological explanations. In this lecture, we've discussed 8 topics. 1. Aristotle's 4 causes. 2. Causation, Mechanism, and Explanation. 3. Aristotle's 4 causes and how and why questions. 4. Unsatisfying causal explanations. 5. Teleological explanation. 6. Purposes, intentions, Explanandum-Teleology and Explanans-Teleology. 7. Causal explanation of the teleological in terms of belief-desire pairs. And 8. Teleological explanations and causal explanations, cautions and conclusions. Thank you.